Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my Lit 101 series by talking about form poems. Poetry nowadays is a little more free-flowing, and the form of the poem is quite often informed by what the poet is trying to get across. And so there aren't as many like hard and fast rules. People still write form poems nowadays, and that's totally fine, but form poetry was more popular in the past. But one thing I really like about form poetry is that it makes us aware in kind of an easier way of how the form of a poem affects the content of a poem. And so today I wanted to talk about two form poems that I really like, and just looking at, instead of just being like a list of this is what this form poem is, then this is what this form poem is, and you need to memorize these kind of thing, because that's not exciting. I wanted to focus on like, how do you analyze a poem by taking the form into account. And so when you're looking at poetry nowadays, or more free verse poetry, you are going to be more aware of how the form affects what it's saying. Because a lot of times if we hear a poem spoken, the way it's spoken is sort of, it gives a different quality to the poem that you wouldn't get when you're reading it. And when you're reading it, you can see the structure of the poem that you might not get when it's being read. So I don't know, I feel like the best way to experience a poem is to see it written down, and then also to hear it spoken aloud, especially if spoken by the poet, because they often kind of give a rhythm and emphasis to elements of the poem that you might not pick up in written form. But today we're looking at form poems, and so we're going to be looking at them. I'm going to have them up on the screen, and then we'll kind of be talking about them briefly. So the two forms that I wanted to look at today are sonnets and villanelles. These are my two favorite form poems, so I'm giving them preferential treatment. There are other form poems, and I may do another video like this kind of in the future, looking at different types of form poems. There's also sestinas, there's haiku, there's concrete poems, there's prose poems, there's even, I don't know what they're officially called, I'm sure there's a term for it, but it's where you take a text from like a book, like a page from a book, and you black out everything except for a few words, and it creates, it allows you to sort of create a poem out of kind of random words from this text. And I don't know what that's called. It's an erasure poem, maybe. I think I'm making that up. But anyway, there's lots of other different types of form poetry, but today we're going to look at kind of the two that I like personally, and so we can do that. So we're going to start off with a sonnet. I did kind of already talk about sonnets earlier when I did the lecture on Ozymandias. Now that was sort of an almost sonnet, like it was mostly a sonnet, but he was playing with the rhyme scheme a little bit to kind of give artistic expression to what the theme of the poem was. And so today I wanted to look at a little bit more structured sonnet. And so we're going to go to Shakespeare, because I like Shakespearean sonnets more than their Italian predecessors. I'm so sorry, Petrarch. So just a quick refresher on what a sonnet is. It's a short poem, it's 14 lines, and it follows kind of a set rhyme scheme. Now, Shakespearean sonnets are great because it's a very structured one. So they follow the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Also, sonnets use iambic pentameter, and there's 5 iambs, or like bounces, per line. So you end up with a poem where each line has 10 syllables, and it follows the rhythm kind of da 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 da. Now, you don't usually read that rhythm that obviously when you're reading it out loud, but the rhythm is kind of there in the background, and it kind of gives a bit of a movement to the poem that you wouldn't normally get. And I picked one that is really easy to understand. This isn't a complicated one. Shakespeare has developed this unfortunate reputation in schools as like, you know, everyone else is sort of easy to read, but Shakespeare is difficult. Shakespeare is hard to read, and it's almost like it's a different language and you have to get it translated, and that's not the case at all. Shakespeare was writing for normal, everyday people, and although the expectations have changed a little bit, and poetry has sort of changed in the hundreds and hundreds of years since Shakespeare was doing his thing. This poem stands out very well. It's easy to understand, it's clear, and it's very cool. So let's get into it. And just to be contrary and shocking, I'm going to be reading from the Longman Anthology of British Literature, not the Norton one. I do have this in the Norton one as well, but Norton gets all the credit for anthologies, and this is my first anthology from my first literature course. It was a British literature course a million billion years ago, and it was taught by this delightful Australian woman who she was just wonderful. Our final exam was watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and it was the best class. And so this was my very first literature anthology, and so I wanted to give it another go. I'm surprised it survived all these years. These ones, the pages are very delicate. But anyways, so where is it here? Here it is. Okay, so this is sonnet 130, and it's called My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. That's the first line. So I'm going to read through it, and then we'll break it down, and we'll see how it goes. All right. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. All right, so what's going on in this poem? Is he mocking his mistress? Is he talking about a dog instead of a person? Like, what is this? Because there's weird stuff going on here. So Shakespeare wrote for everyday people. He was a working class poet and playwright. He wasn't a member of the nobility. He wasn't some high class, mega wealthy, anything like that. He was just writing for people, and he wrote poems and poetry because he wanted to make money, because he wanted to survive. So this poem it's sort of mocking the elevated language that you normally see in love poems. Usually there's this kind of long tradition of like courtly love that's going back to like King Arthur and all that stuff, where you sort of the ideal woman would be like this goddess figure, very unattainable, almost like supermodel good looks, but very pale, very delicate, very artfully trained, and she was basically sort of designed to be a decoration in the house of the man that she would eventually marry. It was not great. It's very chauvinistic. But Shakespeare was writing for everyday people, and so he was not a high-class person, and so he wouldn't have been able to be betrothed to some rich, fancy, noble lady. And so in this poem, he's describing sort of a normal person. And so we get sort of comparisons that at first sound like he's mocking her, but he isn't. And so he's also very self-aware. That's something else to be aware of. And so Shakespeare is aware that he himself has described women in this elevated, unrealistic way. Think Juliet, the way Romeo talks about Juliet is exactly this sort of high, elevated, ridiculous kind of language. So he's aware that he himself has used this language in his poems and in his plays before, but he's describing sort of a normal person. And there's a few details in here that I think are really kind of adorable. When he says, like, if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. So often high-class ladies would be very pale. Their skin would be very white. That was sort of the ideal. That's where you get like Snow White. That's why she was considered to be so beautiful, is because her skin was as white as snow, which means that she stayed inside all the time. She had servants do everything for her. She never had to go out in the sun and work. And so she never developed a tan, because in this day, tans were considered low class. If you had a tan, then that means you were a working person. and you weren't someone who got to live the life of luxury indoors and be waited on. And so he's describing her skin as dun, which is like brown, and he's basically saying that like her skin is tanned and it's nothing at all like, you know, the white snow of like this ideal perfect rich woman that other people would like. And he talks about, you know, her hair being kind of like wiry. Obviously, if she's a working woman, she would be outside, she'd be doing lots of chores, she'd be providing for her family. And so, you know, she wouldn't have time to like get her hair cleaned and perfumed and styled elegantly. She would probably have it like tied up in a kerchief while she was getting things done. So her hair would be kind of wiry, because like normal people's hair kind of does that. If you're not constantly like styling it and getting it professionally done, your hair can get sort of wiry and it can stick out everywhere, and you're just kind of like, whatever. I got rid of that because I don't like my hair anyways. So, and he's describing, you know, I have seen roses damask. Damask sort of means patterned. There's this sort of pattern of red and white that you see in roses, and but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And so she doesn't have the sort of elegant blush that you see on the skin of a noble lady. And so, you know, because she's got a tan and she's working hard, she probably is like, her skin is a bit darker, and so you don't have that white skin with like the delicate rose blush on it. So he's not describing her negatively. I know you can kind of read this and be like, is he making fun of her? He isn't making fun of her at all. He's saying, you know, she's a normal person, she's hardworking, and when you get to the very end, you get this turn, and yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. And so he's saying, my love for her is genuine, and it means more than any sort of false compliment that anyone else could give her. And she probably doubted other people telling her that she's pretty. She's like, yeah, well, whatever. But his love for her is genuine. And so this is a very wholesome, wonderful poem. And we see the rhyme scheme, that A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, whatever, is very structured in here. So we get like sun and dun, red head, white delight, cheeks reeks, no go, sound ground, and then rare and compare. And so this is a much more structured poem than the other sonnet that we read. And so the structure of the poem plays into the image that he's saying. If he had written something like a modern poet, where it sort of is a little more free-flowing, you could still kind of have everything that's in here, and you could have the imagery, and you could have the kind of comparisons and all the kind of wry comedy of it. But the structure of it, it kind of gives you this expectation that you're waiting for that turn at the end, because poems like this would always kind of have sort of a turn where there would be a change. In Italian sonnets, the turn usually happened sort of earlier on in the poem. There was kind of like the first half, and then there'd be a change, and then the second half would kind of take it in a new direction. And a lot of times his poems, he does that sometimes, but a lot of times in his poems, the turn is like right at the end, where he's like, but this is what I'm actually talking about. And so you've got the structure of the poem where you've got this sort of building of tension, because he's describing details about this woman that he loves. He talks about her eyes, her lips, her skin, her hair, and it kind of gives you this sense of rising tension where you're like, what's going on with this woman? Like, what are you doing? Like, who are you describing? What's the catch? You're kind of waiting for the turn to happen, because you want to know if he's mocking this person, if he's actually talking about a dog, and he's like, haha, I'm talking about my beloved pet, not a person. And you're like, what's going on? And so the structure of the poem creates this sort of tension, like you're winding up a toy, and then it releases at the end, and you get the revelation, and yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. So you get that reveal at the end. He's like, actually, I think she's pretty great, and my love for her is as genuine as anything. And so the structure of the poem works to highlight what's going on in the poem here. And so what you think is sort of a humorous poem where he's mocking a woman, it turns out to be a very wholesome poem where he's saying, actually, these are all the things that I really admire about her, because she's hardworking and she's not like this froofy, you know, noble person that's sort of detached from real life. She's a real person, she exists in the real world, and I think she's pretty great. And that's why I think this poem is wonderful. But so that's a good example of a sonnet where the structure of the sonnet really does work to, I don't know, create the special effects of the poem, because poems are all about causing the reader to feel something, and there's often this kind of expectation and then reality. And the sonnet is, it's not just sort of a box that you sort of cram a poem into, where you're saying like, I have this poem, and you write the poem, and then you like hack at it and squish it down to make it fit into the form. If you do that, you're not going to get a very good poem. And so a good form poem uses the form, like uses the limitations of it to tell a really interesting mini story, or to create a really beautiful image, or to pull the rug out from under the audience's feet, because a lot of times Shakespeare's poems have this kind of this comedic element to it where he's kind of being funny. There's some that are more romantic, there's some that are just talking about the emotions of everyday life, but he does often do this thing where he's like kind of playing with the audience a little bit, because Shakespeare was funny as well as he was an amazing observer of human nature. So that is Sonnet 130 by William Shakespeare. We're going to move on and talk about a different kind of form poem now. Next up is a poem called The Villanelle, and this is another one that I really, really love. And it's a very cool kind of structure to it. Basically, the Villanelle evolved out of Italian and Spanish songs, and it didn't really become kind of coalesced with all of its rules until later, but it still kind of has this sort of musical quality. It's got this sort of flair and rhythm to it that you can see definitely coming from kind of music, and it's really, really interesting. So The Villanelle is a poem of 19 lines, and it's broken up into stanzas of 3 lines each, and then at the end it's a 4-line stanza that it finishes with. And it's got this rhyme scheme of ABA, and then the last line is ABAA. And what it does is the first and third line of the first stanza become sort of repeated refrains that come back again and again throughout the poem. So the first line of the poem is repeated in the second and fourth stanzas, and the third line of the first stanza is repeated in the third and fifth stanzas at the end. And then the final stanza ends with sort of both refrains at the end, forming kind of a rhyming couplet. And then all throughout this, there's this very rigid ABA rhyme scheme. So every stanza has ABA. So every first and third line has to rhyme with every other first and third line, and every second line rhymes with every other second line. And so it's a really kind of complicated structure, but when it works really, really well. Now, this is a poem that you may have heard before. It was used in the movie Interstellar. I think the full poem is included in like the soundtrack of that, read by the cast, which is very cool. And you've probably heard of this before, but the poem is called Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. Now, this was written in 1952. It is not in the public domain, but I'm not making any money off of this, so, you know, lawyers, if, you know, please don't sue me. So I'm going to read through it, and then we'll talk about how the structure sort of affects the theme of the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. I love this poem so much. It's like chilling. This poem kind of has the quality of a eulogy. It may or may not have been autobiographical. Usually with modern poems, we always say like the speaker of the poem is different from the poet. unless you're talking about confessional poetry, which is specifically about the poet's life. But this is kind of around the age of the confessional poets. I don't think Dylan Thomas was part of the confessional poets movement, but this could have been influenced by his autobiographical life. His father didn't pass away until after the poem was written, so it does make sense that this would be something that he would write to someone who is near death. But the poem has sort of the quality of kind of demanding that someone don't go into kind of the afterlife with sort of a fading whimper. They want them to sort of charge at the afterlife with a sort of zeal and vehemence that sort of, you go out as you've lived, sort of bright and shining. And this could also be directed at sort of everyone in general. It's sort of saying, live your life powerfully and unapologetically, and take advantage of every day that you have, because, to just sort of fade away and give up and become sort of a hollow shell of who you are is sort of an empty way to live. And so he's saying, live vibrantly and brightly, and when you die, charge into death with a fierce violence that would kind of make everyone else proud, so to speak. One thing that I really love about this one is that the structure of the poem, again, really reinforces the message of the poem, because we've got that refrain, those two refrains that come back. So it kind of takes on the quality of like a sermon. If you think of the the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. I know that's kind of a cliche example, but he used that repeating phrase, I have a dream, throughout for kind of maximum impact. And this poem sort of uses it in the same way. It has this repeated refrain where each time it shows up, it gets stronger and stronger and more powerful. And the more he looks at sort of the way people deal with things, the more power the refrains sort of get, until at the very end, when he repeats both of the refrains together, they kind of have this maximum impact and they just hit you right in the center of your soul. I think it works really well. And also we've got the rhyme scheme. And like I said, it's ABA for everything, and then the final stanza is ABAA. But I like how the two end sounds that he chose are contrasting. So we've got ite, we've got night, light, right, night, bright, light, flight, night, sight, light, height, night, light. And so that's a very kind of bright and aggressive. But then the other rhyming end sound is A. So we've got day, they, bay, way, gay, pray. And so you've got this sort of contrast of sort of this aggressive sound and this more gentle sound. And the more gentle sound is in the middle of each stanza. So it's got this kind of like push and pull. So it's got aggressive and then softer, and then aggressive and then softer. And it has that sort of rhythm throughout. And so he uses the rhyme scheme really well. If he had done all kind of aggressive, sharp sounds for all of the rhyming words, it would have been almost too much. There wouldn't have been that kind of contrast between those different kinds of sounds, and it would have undermined the power of the poem itself. And so in that sense, we've got another poem where the very rigid structure of the villanelle really helps to hammer home the kind of emotion of the poem, because this is a poem that's not necessarily angry, but it is very emotionally charged and kind of aggressive. And if you notice, in each of the stanzas, there's images that relate to kind of light and brightness, and it's all sort of very vibrant. And so you've got burning in the first stanza. In the second one, you've got lightning. In the third one, we've got the word bright. In the next one, they've got the sun. In the next one, they've got blinding, and then we've got blaze like meteors. So again, lots of really bright, kind of dramatic images. And then the last stanza doesn't have that. The last stanza, it brings itself down to earth, and the only real kind of striking image in this one is fierce tears. And so again, that's something that could be bright, but it's not as vibrant and aggressive as the other imagery in the poem. And so you've now got, the emotion of everything, and then it backs off where you realize what's happening, and it's the speaker speaking to their father who's about to die, and the image there is tears. And so you've got this vibrant anger throughout, and then it backs off, and you realize what all that anger is sort of concealing, and you've got the real emotion of what's happening. And the structure of the poem works really well to set that up, because the final two refrains now have a slightly different quality. They have more emotion to them. At first it seems like he's talking about sort of all people, you know, in general, but at the very end you realize he's actually talking about his father who's about to die, and he doesn't like seeing him fading away by inches. And so those final two things, instead of being for all people, it's a son to his father saying, you know, when you're gone, I want you to go out like a blaze of glory, kind of thing. And it just hits you right here. It's so good. This poem is fantastic. And I know it's sort of overused a bit. I think people use the poem a bit too much in kind of pop culture. I feel that way about another poem by William Butler Yeats called The Second Coming. And it's one of his absolute best poems. It's so good, but it's sort of used all the time as an example of like an apocalyptic poem, and everyone uses it to the point where it's sort of losing its energy. So I will eventually talk about that poem because I love it so much, but not yet. So, okay, so that is the Villanelle. Now, I don't have time to go through all the other sort of types of form poems, but like I said, I may do more videos on different other types of form poems if you're interested, because I think form poems are a good way to train you to look at how form influences the meaning of the poem itself. A lot of poems nowadays are more free form, and sometimes poets will take a form and deconstruct it a bit. So if you see like a sonnet nowadays, it might not rigidly follow all the rules of like a Shakespearean sonnet, but it's sort of sonnet-esque. And the way that they break the rules is very interesting, and, you know, gives you some really cool effects in the poem. And so I like starting with form poetry before you dive into sort of the super free form stuff, because it kind of trains you for what kind of things to look at. Now, moving on, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing a 2-part video on the poem, the epic poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because it is a Christmas poem, believe it or not. And it's pretty short. It's not as long as like the Odyssey or the Iliad or anything, but it's a great story. You can find it for free online. I'm going to be doing part 1 next week, and then part 2 the week after, so it'll be after Christmas. Yes, no, it'll be right before Christmas. And hopefully that will be a lot of fun, because we're getting into medieval poetry. It's about King Arthur, and it's great. And then you can see the movie The Green Knight and appreciate the story even more. So I'm going to go into that next week. So if you want to read it ahead of time, or get into reading at least the first part, it's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There's a bunch of different translations out there, but they're all pretty good. J.R.R. Tolkien, I think, did one that's really good. The translation I have isn't his, but it's still pretty good, and I really like that one. But that's what I'm going to be doing next week and the week after. So just a heads up, we're reading something longer, and so there is kind of homework, but it's pretty short, so you should be able to kind of plow through it fairly quickly. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.